The CAF buzzed with the usual afternoon chatter, clinking cups, murmured conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. The scent of fresh coffee and baked pastries hung in the air, wrapping the little corner shop in a comforting warmth. It was the kind of place where people stopped in for a quick break from their day, lost in their own worlds. At a table near the window, a man in his late 30s leaned back in his chair, his designer jacket draped casually over the seat. He scrolled through his phone with a smirk, barely noticing the elderly woman who had just walked in. She was dressed modestly, worn-out shoes, a faded scarf wrapped around her shoulders. To him, she was just another old lady, slow and out of place in a CAF filled with younger professionals and college students. As she shuffled toward the counter, fumbling for her wallet, the man let out a scoff loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Why do people like that even come to places like this?" he muttered under his breath, nudging his friend at the table. His companion, shifting uncomfortably, gave a nervous chuckle but said nothing. The elderly woman, unaware or simply choosing to ignore the remark, took her time ordering a simple cup of tea. She smiled warmly at the barista, who returned the kindness without hesitation. But the man wasn't done. He rolled his eyes as she turned to find a seat, scanning the crowded CAF for an empty spot. "Watch," he said to his friend, "she's going to take forever to sit down." Sure enough, the woman moved carefully, her hands slightly trembling as she pulled out a chair. The man laughed, shaking his head as if her mere presence was an inconvenience. "Probably going to sit there for hours and not order anything else," he muttered. What he didn't know, what no one in the CAF knew, was that this woman wasn't just any elderly lady. She carried a past that could silence the entire room. And in a matter of moments, his cruel words would come back to haunt him in a way he never expected. The moment of truth was coming. And when it did, it would leave him speechless. The elderly woman sat down carefully, her movements slow but deliberate. She placed her small cup of tea on the table, her hands wrapped gently around it as if drawing warmth from the porcelain. Her eyes, though softened by age, held a quiet depth, scanning the room as if she were seeing something beyond what was there. The man at the other table smirked again, shaking his head. "Bet she's one of those people who just sits around and pretends to read a book, trying to act like she belongs," he muttered. His friend gave another uneasy chuckle but avoided making eye contact. But the woman didn't take out a book. Instead, she just sat there, her fingers lightly tapping against the rim of her cup. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant. Then, almost as if she could hear everything being said about her, she turned her head slightly in the man's direction. Her eyes met his. There was no anger, no offense taken. Just a steady, unwavering gaze that sent a strange chill down his spine. He frowned, suddenly feeling oddly exposed, as if he were the one being studied instead of the other way around. He looked back at his phone, scrolling mindlessly to shake the feeling. But something about her presence unsettled him. He couldn't put his finger on it. The CAF continued its usual rhythm, orders being called out, conversations weaving in and out of the background noise, doors opening and closing as new customers arrived. But the man found himself stealing occasional glances at the woman, each time expecting her to be doing something ordinary. She wasn't. At one point, she closed her eyes briefly, her lips moving slightly as if whispering something under her breath. A habit? A prayer? He couldn't tell. But the moment stretched on just long enough to make him shift uncomfortably in his seat. His friend finally noticed his distraction. "Dude, why do you keep looking at her?" The man scoffed, as if brushing off the question. "I don't." He hesitated, realizing he didn't have an answer. "She just gives me a weird vibe, that's all." His friend glanced over at the woman, who now seemed entirely absorbed in the simple act of sipping her tea. "She looks harmless to me," he said. "Maybe you're overthinking it." "Maybe," the man muttered. But he wasn't convinced. Something about her was different. A few more minutes passed, and the CAF remained its usual busy self. But then, a shift. A subtle one. The way people unconsciously adjust when something out of the ordinary is about to happen. The barista at the counter, a young woman with bright eyes and an easy smile, glanced toward the elderly woman's table. Her face changed, first surprise, then recognition, then something else. Respect? Admiration? She leaned over and whispered something to her coworker. The coworker's eyes widened, and suddenly, the two of them were whispering back and forth, occasionally looking over at the elderly woman with an almost reverent expression. The man noticed. He frowned, watching as the barista hurried to the back and returned a moment later with the CAF manager, a man in his 50s. The manager took one look at the woman and froze. His hands tightened slightly at his sides before he smoothed his expression and walked toward her table. The CAF had begun to change. The man, still watching, suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that he was missing something important. The manager reached the elderly woman's table, standing there for a moment before speaking. "Ma'am," he said, his voice careful, respectful. "I didn't expect to see you here today." The woman looked up, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Neither did I," she said simply. The manager hesitated, then glanced toward the barista, who was practically holding her breath. "Please," he continued, his voice softer, "is there anything we can do for you?" The woman shook her head. "Just the tea," she said. "That's all I needed." But the energy in the CAF had shifted. More people were noticing. A few heads turned, whispers passing from table to table. The man at the other table felt his chest tighten slightly. He didn't know why. He leaned toward his friend. "Okay, seriously, who is she?" His friend shrugged, but the barista was now moving toward their table, excitement barely contained. "You don't know?" she asked, her voice hushed but filled with awe. The man shook his head, feeling his impatience grow. "No." "Who is she?" The barista hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret that wasn't meant to be spoken too loudly. "That," she said, nodding toward the elderly woman, "is someone you never, ever mock." The man felt a sudden weight settle in his stomach. His mouth felt dry. Because in that moment, without even knowing the full story, he realized one thing. He had made a mistake. The man's grip tightened around his coffee cup, his pulse quickening in a way he didn't understand. The barista's words hung in the air, thick with meaning, but she didn't explain further. Instead, she turned away, leaving him sitting there with the weight of something unknown pressing against his chest. His friend shifted in his seat, clearly sensing the unease growing between them. "Okay," his friend said, his voice lower now. "This is getting weird." The man nodded, though he wasn't sure why he suddenly felt nervous. The woman hadn't done anything. She hadn't spoken a single word to him. And yet, the way people were looking at her now, the way the manager had addressed her, made it clear she was not just some random elderly woman stopping in for tea. He glanced over at her table again. She still sat there, calm as ever, sipping from her cup. But there was something different now. It was in the way the CAF itself seemed to shift around her. The whispers. The careful glances. The silent understanding passing between the staff and a few of the older customers who had started noticing her, their expressions changing from casual indifference to quiet recognition. The man swallowed hard. He wanted to ask someone. He wanted to demand an explanation, to know why he suddenly felt like he had mocked the wrong person. Then, as if sensing the weight of his gaze, the woman looked up again. This time, she didn't just glance in his direction. She met his eyes. And this time, the look she gave him made his stomach twist. It wasn't anger. It wasn't offense. It was something deeper, something unreadable. It was the kind of look that stripped a person bare. The man forced himself to hold her gaze, but for the first time in his life, he felt small. His friend cleared his throat. "Maybe we should go." The man shook his head, not even sure why he was refusing. He wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not without understanding. Then, just as he was about to speak, the CAF door opened, and a new presence entered the room. An older man, dressed in a dark suit, walked inside. His posture was straight, his face lined with the kind of experience that came with age and authority. He carried himself with purpose, and the second he stepped in, his eyes scanned the CAF as if searching for someone. When his gaze landed on the elderly woman, something in his expression softened. He didn't hesitate. He moved toward her table immediately. And the CAF, already tense with unspoken energy, seemed to hold its breath. The man watched as the older gentleman reached the woman's table and without hesitation bowed his head slightly in respect. Not a nod. Not a polite greeting. A bow. The elderly woman looked up, a small, knowing smile appearing on her lips. "You always were the respectful one," she murmured, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. The man at the other table felt his chest tighten again. Who was she? The older gentleman straightened, his voice measured but warm. "It has been too long," he said. "I was told you might be here today." The woman nodded. It seemed like a good day for tea. The man's mind was spinning. The staff. The manager. Now this suited gentleman bowing his head in recognition. He wanted to know. He needed to know. And then, just as he was about to lean in, to try and catch another piece of this mystery unfolding before him, the woman finally spoke again, this time, directing her words toward him. Without looking away from her guest, she set her tea down and said, in a voice just loud enough to be heard, "You never know who you're speaking to, do you?" The words were soft. Simple. But they landed with a force that sent an uneasy shiver down his spine. The man felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The elderly woman's words, though spoken softly, carried a weight that pressed down on him. His fingers curled against the table, his mind racing to make sense of everything happening around him. "You never know who you're speaking to, do you?" The words repeated in his head, echoing louder each time. He forced a swallow, his throat suddenly dry. His friend shifted beside him, clearly feeling the same unease, but neither of them spoke. The older gentleman standing by the woman's table took a seat across from her, his expression one of deep respect. The two of them seemed to exist in a space separate from the rest of the CAF, as if the energy in the room had reshaped itself around them. Then, the door swung open again. This time, two men in dark uniforms stepped inside. Their presence commanded immediate attention, their movements sharp and precise. The man at the table stiffened. Police? No, their uniforms were different. Something about them felt more formal, more significant. They scanned the CAF, their eyes landing on the elderly woman almost instantly. Then, without hesitation, both men approached her table, standing just a few steps away, their hands clasped in front of them in a stance that spoke of discipline. The CAF, which had already been quiet with growing tension, now fell into complete silence. Conversation stopped. Every movement froze. Even the barista, who had been pretending to wipe down the counter while eavesdropping, stood still, wide-eyed. Then, one of the men spoke. "Madam," he said, his voice measured, filled with unmistakable reverence. "We weren't informed of your visit." The elderly woman looked up, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't planned," she said simply. "I wanted some tea." The officer or whatever he was exchanged a glance with his companion, and something silent passed between them. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, both men gave a small, formal bow. The man at the table felt his heart slam against his ribs. His hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He had been mocking this woman just moments ago. Dismissing her. Laughing at her. And now, people in uniforms were bowing to her. Who was she? The elderly woman finally turned her head toward him, and for the first time, he saw the quiet power in her gaze. Not arrogance. Not pride. Just certainty. A presence that didn't need to demand respect because it already existed in the air around her. "You never know who you're speaking to," she repeated, softer this time. And then, she smiled. Not cruelly. Not smugly, but with the kind of knowing look that sent a shiver down his spine. The manager of the CAF cleared his throat and stepped forward hesitantly. "Madam, would you like us to clear the CAF for your privacy?" The man stiffened. "The CAF? Cleared?" The woman let out a soft chuckle. "No need," she said, waving a hand. "I'm just an old woman enjoying a cup of tea." The uniformed men remained standing, their posture unwavering, but they said nothing more. They simply waited. The man could barely breathe. His friend was gripping his coffee cup so tightly it might crack. The CAF staff stood frozen, their eyes darting between the woman and the men standing beside her. Everything had shifted. And then, the elderly woman lifted her cup again, took another slow sip of tea, and set it down with a quiet clink. She turned her gaze back toward the man, her expression calm. "Tell me," she said, tilting her head slightly, "what was it you were saying about people like me earlier?" His stomach dropped. The entire CAF was watching now. Listening. He felt his mouth go dry. Words wouldn't come. Because now, in the suffocating silence of the room, he knew whatever answer he gave would change everything. The man felt like the entire CAF had closed in on him, the weight of the woman's words pressing down on his chest. His heart pounded. His mind raced, scrambling for anything to say. But nothing came. Nothing felt right. The elderly woman waited, her eyes never leaving his. She wasn't angry. She wasn't amused. She was simply waiting. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The uniformed men stood motionless, their presence making it clear that whoever this woman was, she was not to be taken lightly. The manager, the barista, the other customers, they were all watching, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, shock, and anticipation. Finally, the man swallowed hard. He stopped, his voice barely working. His arrogance, his smugness, all of it had vanished. He felt small, exposed. "I didn't mean anything by it," he finally muttered, though the words felt hollow. The woman raised an eyebrow, as if considering his response. Then, she sighed softly and shook her head. "That's the problem, isn't it?" she said, her voice gentle but firm. "People speak without thinking. They judge without knowing. They mock without understanding." He lowered his gaze, shame creeping into his chest. He had never felt this way before, not from a lecture, not from an argument. This was different. This was a quiet truth settling over him, forcing him to see himself as he truly was. The woman lifted her cup again, taking one last sip of tea before setting it down with deliberate care. Then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, placing it on the table in front of her. It was a medal. Not just any medal. A symbol of honor. Of recognition. The kind awarded to those who had done something extraordinary, something people never forgot. The room seemed to hold its breath as the realization spread. A whisper rippled through the CAF. A few older customers nodded in recognition, their expressions shifting from curiosity to deep respect. The man stared at the medal, his mind reeling. His stomach twisted as the pieces clicked into place. She wasn't just anyone. She was someone history had remembered. The suited gentleman across from her finally spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge the man didn't yet have. "You never wanted recognition," he said softly. "But people like you deserve it." The woman smiled faintly. "Recognition is fleeting," she said. "Character lasts." The man felt a lump in his throat. He had mocked a woman who had done more in her lifetime than he ever would. He had reduced her to nothing with a careless remark, not knowing that she carried a story greater than his own. The elderly woman glanced at him one last time. "You may not remember me," she said, "but I hope you remember this." Then, she stood. The entire CAF seemed to move with her, an unspoken shift of energy, as if something important had just taken place, something no one would forget. The suited gentleman stood as well, nodding in quiet respect as she turned toward the door. The uniformed men stepped aside, waiting for her to pass. She didn't need them. But they were there anyway. As she walked out, the CAF remained silent, as if the world itself had paused to let her leave in peace. The man sat frozen, his hands still gripping the edge of his cup. He didn't know what to do, what to say. His friend was staring at him, wide-eyed, but neither of them spoke. The barista finally exhaled, breaking the stillness. "You asked who she was," she murmured, barely above a whisper. The man looked up, his throat tight. The barista's eyes softened. "She's the kind of person you should never forget." The CAF slowly returned to life, people whispering, exchanging glances, processing what had just happened. But the man? He just sat there, staring at the empty table where the elderly woman had been. And for the first time in his life, he wished he had never opened his mouth at all. The man remained seated, his fingers still wrapped around his cup, though the coffee inside had long gone cold. His friend hadn't spoken, and for once, neither had he. The hum of the CAF returned, gradually, soft whispers, the clinking of cups, the low buzz of conversation, but everything felt different now, like the air itself had shifted. He swallowed, his throat tight. His mind replayed everything: the look in the elderly woman's eyes, the quiet authority she carried, the way the entire room had moved around her presence. And that medal. That single, simple object had spoken louder than anything else. He felt foolish. No worse than foolish. He felt ashamed. The woman had never needed to defend herself. She hadn't fought back, hadn't demanded respect. She had simply existed, and the world had responded accordingly. And yet, he had mocked her. Judged her. Reduced her to nothing more than an old lady sitting alone in his CAF. His stomach twisted at the realization. How many times had he done this before? How many times had he laughed at someone without knowing their story? Dismissed them without understanding who they really were? His friend shifted beside him, finally breaking the silence. "Dude," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know what to say." Neither did he. The CAF door swung open again, and for a split second, his heart leapt, almost hoping she had returned. But it was just another customer, oblivious to what had just taken place. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Who was she? He finally asked, his voice hoarse, directed toward no one in particular. The barista, who had been watching him carefully, took a step closer. "You really don't know?" she asked, her expression unreadable. He shook his head. "No. But I need to." She studied him for a moment before leaning against the counter. "Her name is Eleanor James," she said softly. The name meant nothing to him. But then, the manager spoke up from the other side of the CAF, his voice steady. "Look her up." The man hesitated for only a moment before pulling out his phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed the name into the search bar. And then, his breath caught in his throat. Article after article appeared. Photos, some old, some recent. Headlines that made his pulse quicken. Military honors. Humanitarian work. Decades of service. She wasn't just someone. She was a hero. His mouth went dry as he scrolled through page after page, absorbing everything. She had saved lives. Changed policies. Built schools, hospitals, shelters. Her name wasn't just known, it was respected, written in history books, honored by leaders. And he had laughed at her. A deep, gnawing shame settled in his chest, heavier than anything he had ever felt before. He set his phone down, staring at the table, his thoughts in chaos. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The barista gave a small, knowing smile. "Most people don't get the chance to realize that." He nodded slowly. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his own actions in a way that couldn't be ignored. His friend cleared his throat. "So what now?"
The man didn't answer right away. He just sat there, letting the moment sink in.
Then, without a word, he stood up. The CAF felt different as he moved toward the door warmer, heavier, as if something had changed inside him. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never make the same mistake again.